Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. The date is, what was it again? February 7th today, and we're going to be discussing trade policy. So, for policy wonks out there, this should be a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about, of course, the tariff policies, our trade policies with respect to Canada, Mexico, and China. But maybe we'll discuss some other things like more Doge news, RFK Jr.'s kind of potential involvement in the president's cabinet here. And yeah, we'll just kind of see where the conversation takes us. So yeah, we are also missing Tanya today. Tanya actually had to attend some early morning workshops, trainings, etc. I don't know any of the details, but I believe a lot of it is in response to the Trump administration's executive activity. I don't know exactly what Tanya does or where she works with this position, but it might involve interactions with the federal government, and obviously that's being shaked up quite a lot by the Trump administration.
I imagine she's quite busy these days.
Oh yeah, a lot of people are quite busy these days.
Mm-hmm.
But Eric, you and I have time to sit down and blabber our mouths about trade policy, give just some thoughts. I mean, we're more interested in the conversation than kind of maybe our PhD level advocacies on economics or something like that. I don't know what your qualifications are, but at the very least, I know that you've done your research, and I'd imagine you have some interesting thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing we need to do before we get into all these tariffs is, I think, separate the North American policies from the Chinese policies. I think there's a high likelihood that the 10% on Chinese goods is going to stay, as they are an adversarial nation, and Trump talks a big game on a lot of things, but he's shown a willingness to hold with his China policies. Now, I think there's a whole lot of meat on the bone of the North American stuff, because there's in some ways an understandable backlash to tariffing our neighbors by a quarter. That's a heavy percentage, and it could really, really, really shock the economy. I mean, you even saw Monday, before the 30-day pause was announced, that the stock market took a tumble, and it recovered. But I think, I would hope, in fact, that at the end of this 30-day period, the trade deals and the negotiations have worked themselves out so much that you don't see that 25% number go into effect. Will you see a number go into effect on all goods? It's possible, but yeah, I'm not sure. But I think there's certainly more negotiations to come on that front.
Well, you're making a good point here, and that's kind of what's the motivation behind these tariffs? Why are they being implemented? Is it actually to maintain these sorts of tariffs, or is it useful as more of a bargaining chip or something along those lines, or a first step in negotiations? I mean, the Trump administration talks all the time about how they want to be kind of really hard, economic, transactional on, our relationships with other countries. And so maybe this is kind of just stick-based policy to adopt, in those negotiations. But I mean, even though that's a possibility, I'm still not sure. I really don't know exactly what's going on in Trump's mind or other officials' minds when we're implementing these tariffs. What's the end game here precisely? I saw a little bit of a shift with Mexico. There was the pause on the tariffs, and then lots of kind of policy, I guess integration would be the word here, on the Mexican border. So yeah, I think something like that's possible, but I'm just not sure exactly what the motivation here, exactly what the trajectory is. I don't know if anyone is outside of the White House, and even then, they might be kind of playing it by ear here. So you're writing a paper on this, Eric, actually for ONC. You're writing an op-ed on North American trade policy. Can you tell me a little bit about with the perspective you're adopting as far as maybe these tariffs are just, a tool in a wider set of negotiations here. Um, what's kind of the policy position you take as far as what the ideal outcome here is? Yeah, what would you like to see as far as whether these tariffs remain, what happens, in light of them, et cetera?
Sure. So I think, like you said, it's hard to get at the heart of what the president is thinking. But I think it's a worthwhile venture to ask, is he ideologically committed to these tariffs?
Mm,
Or is he ideologically committed to many things? Because in the past, we've seen him change his stances, kind of in a more populist fashion, like stuff on abortion and stuff like that. In my heart of hearts, I still believe Trump is a pro-choice man. I mean, his wife is pro-choice, came out that way during the election cycle. So I don't think he, in his heart of hearts, even though he called tariffs the most beautiful thing in the world and praised William
uh-huh.
McKinley, I don't know that he's ideologically committed. And he's put forward the madman kind of theory before, right? This was something that Nixon wanted people to think, and he was so out of the box that you couldn't pin him down. Some of the stuff I'm writing about in my paper is the recent developments with Colombia. They wouldn't take that one deportation flight filled with expatriates, and the rumor is he was on the golf course. He got on the phone. He called and said 25% tariffs are coming your way, and within an hour, Colombian president put out a you know, pretty grievous statement on the affair. But even going back to Trump term one, along these lines, there were negotiations with South Korea for a new trade policy, and Trump told his top negotiator, "Make them think that I'm crazy. Essentially, make them think that I could pull out of this thing at any second." So I think there's legitimacy to some of that kind of madman theory, and I don't think he's going to die on the hill of tariffs. Now that being said, I think if there's one thing that Trump wants less than a policy win, it's looking weak. So
Mm,
if he doesn't get everything that he thinks that he needs, and we get to the end of this 30-day period, and I think he'll let the tariffs go through. Uh, Now, as far as my personal position, I don't want to see that. Now,
mm,
I could live with some moderated tariffs on certain sectors because I do think cheap labor costs have driven away a lot of American manufacturing and a lot of businesses. In his first term, he tariffed products more than he tariffed countries. So steel, aluminum, and you could see that in his voting base in Pennsylvania. I think that was a wise political play. I don't think Donald Trump is in love with steel and aluminum tariffs on an ideological level.
mm,
I think he's a political operator in these realms. Now, I could be wrong about that, but either way, the policy is what matters. So, I think Canada and Mexico have large incentives to come to the table and grant more concessions because if these 25% tariffs were to see the light of day, it would hurt us, but it would really, really hurt Canada. I think I saw some
mm,
statistic that around 60 to 70% of all of their exports are to the United States. So that would be challenging. So I think we will see some moderation on these policies. What that looks like, where the concessions are, could be really anything. I mean, look at what he's trying to do with El Salvador. I mean, that's totally out of the box. Look at what he's trying to do with Gaza. I mean, these
mm,
things are high flying, kind of, very
mm.
anti status quo. So I think we're going to see some changes here in the next 30 days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a lot of unpredictability. I mean, I thought I had a handle at least on the Trump administration's kind of foreign policy, how he approached things there, and then the Gaza proposal came out. And I'm like, I really don't understand what's going on here anymore. I mean, we talk about how we're sending too much foreign aid, how we're entangling ourselves in the Middle East and there other areas too much. We need to get out. And then the idea is that we take on the brunt of the responsibility for rebuilding Gaza. It's just, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, what's going on behind closed doors, what the end game here is, but yeah, it's very unpredictable. It's very hard to see, what's rhetoric, what its motive is, whether it's just being put forward as an actual proposal, or whether there's, kind of something else, some subversion that's going to come. I'm not sure, but getting back to tariff policy here, let's talk for a minute about, at least just based on our research, what we're seeing the implications, of tariffs could actually be. Because I think that we're both kind of opposed to the idea of widespread tariffs being maintained, but maybe we can, give listeners an idea as to why exactly that is. So I know that, Trump obviously offers lots of rhetoric on how tariffs are incredibly useful. They'll create tons of jobs, create tons of value. I have some thoughts, at least just based on what I've read from, obviously there's analyses published by people like Wall Street Journal, but going a little deeper, the Tax Foundation. I know that a little while ago, Erica York, who's the VP at that foundation, gave a really in-depth testimony at a legislative hearing about this subject and the effects of tariffs, alternatives to them, et cetera. So that's kind of where I'm getting my information. But I want to start with you because I'd imagine you've done more research than me. What are you seeing as the effects of tariffs here?
I think, just on a more granular level, there's three main sectors of the economy that this is going to hit.
Hmm.
The biggest one being the car market. If you look at the voyage, if you will, of certain car parts, they can cross the Canadian border, the Mexican border, the Chinese border
Hmm.
3 or 4 different times in the process of building a car. So that's
Hmm.
going to raise, the average car price, MSRP, I believe it's called, by about $3,000 to $4,000. It's going to hit produce, especially if the Mexican tariffs see the light of day. And I think it could induce a trade war, which is something that's not new to American politics. I mean, tariffs were a large part of our Treasury Department for much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, till we got away from them more towards the 1920s. But that being said, I think there's some value to long-term tariffs. I think if we were able to leave, a moderate amount of tariffs in place over the course of 20, 40, 50 years, then you could see a manufacturing base really solidify and form. Now, that would take some presidential consensus on these matters, which we know is not always there. Now, I saw recently that Canada is having, an internal, I guess, summit, if you will, on how to kind of deal with these tariffs if they hit the ground running. And that's not good because they're looking to diversify from other export sources and they're looking to internally build up their own structures. Yeah, we it might sound a little off-putting, but we want the Canadians dependent on us for a multitude of things because that really helps our economy. And I think Trump's bluster about the 51st state, I think that's really what he's talking about. I think he's saying, look, this is an economy that if we shut down the border, if we shut down all relations with Canada tomorrow, they would have a hard time existing in the short term. And I think that's actually a good thing for both of our countries. With Mexico, the policy is a little more nuanced. There's a lot more people in Mexico. They've shown, a little more kindness as the whole of Latin America has to more outside forces. Especially China. China has, a considerable presence in Mexican politics, which is another reason, before we haven't even gotten into this yet, but a lot of the concessions that he extracted before for the 30-day pause on both of these 25% duties were centered around the fentanyl trade, and security apparatchiks. Like you said before we started, integration of U.S., Mexican, and Canadian forces to stop the drug flow, to stop the migrant crossings. Which there's an open question about how much that really happens on the Canadian border. I saw some statistic that there was only 43 pounds seized last year or the year before, which
Hmm.
doesn't sound like a whole lot. That's still enough to kill thousands of people.
Yeah.
But that being said, it's so large that it seems incredibly difficult to monitor such a vast area. Not to ramble too long on these things, but in 2019, Trump threatened a 5% tariff on all Mexican goods, just 5%. And he was able to get the former Mexican president to send 10,000 troops to the border along certain, checkpoints and, normal crossing points. And that really did help the migrant flow, it seems, in some fashion. So I think he's looking for that. I think he's looking for fentanyl policy, and it's possible. I think he's looking for an entire rewrite, a trade rewrite, because the dependency with the Canadian economy and lesser so to the Mexican economy is so obvious.
Yeah, so I have thoughts on a few things that you mentioned there. Let's start first of all with just kind of a small detail that you mentioned earlier, and that's that you'd be in favor of kind of moderate tariffs here if they could be maintained across presidencies. I'd imagine actually that if tariffs, when tariffs are implemented, unless they're revoked or changed quite quickly, from what I've read, it seems that they get pretty institutionally ingrained, and it can be really hard to remove them after the fact. That's why, for instance, that there was a really weird trade war. I can't remember the exact dates. I think it was in the 60s or something along those lines. It was the chicken war. Have you heard of this?
I have not. No.
So it was this kind of trade debacle with Germany, where we exported tons of chicken. That was one of the main things that the United States was producing. We or at the very least, it was a very big export market here. We sent a lot of this to Germany, and then they implemented some policy. It might have been a tariff policy. I can't remember the details. But we engaged in this trade war, and we put tariffs on a lot of German cars coming in. And even after, we no longer have like a vast chicken export industry, or the trade debacle has subsided. Now we're long past that. A lot of these tariffs still remain in place just because they haven't been revoked by Congress, or the presidency. There's really no ideological or lobbyist basis for maintaining them, but they've stayed. So it seems to me, based on what I'm seeing, that a lot of these tariffs, once they're implemented and maintained, they just largely aren't revoked. And I mean, we saw that with the Biden administration as well. When Trump's tariffs were implemented, Biden continued to keep them in place, even added to them in a number of cases. We were talking about this a little bit just before we started. So I don't know if like ideological consensus on tariffs is required to maintain them. I think that once they're implemented, it's just kind of a numbers game, looking at, okay, we're getting government revenue from this. We don't really want to get rid of this. There's a number of kind of like manufacturers, et cetera, that are dependent on the status quo now. We don't really want to upset that, change things or shake things up. People have gotten used to this. Now, whether that maintains for a massive tariff policy, like 25% on all imports from a particular country, that might be a little different, just because of how big and wide-reaching that is. But just as you were saying that one weird incident came up to the forefront of my mind, and I'd imagine that there's a good chance something like this would be maintained for a number of decades, especially if it was a moderate tariff. Anyways, moving on to some of the other things that you said here. Now, I'm kind of curious as to what, in your view, the justification is, even for kind of small scale or moderate tariffs. Now, I know that the idea is that, well, we promote domestic manufacturing, especially from the foreign dumping of a lot of cheap goods, so we raise the price on those. It protects our industries. But based on what I've read, once again, I'm no expert economist here. Based on what I've read, it seems like, first of all, any gains in manufacturing are usually offset by costs in downstream manufacturing, right? So even if we promote steel production in the United States, that means that because prices are higher, et cetera, the costs of using that steel to produce other products, in United States companies, et cetera, increases. We might lose jobs in those downstream industries. And of course, a lot of these costs are passed on to consumers, to the point where we raise the cost of various goods. And it doesn't really seem to me like there's much of any of an economic benefit besides protecting some relatively inefficient industries, in upstream manufacturing and just producing raw resources like steel, et cetera. So tell me a little bit about your justification for these moderate tariffs in North America, what you really hope that these policies would accomplish.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things that we kind of need to delve into here. The first is that I think you're right generally, that whenever you put a policy, which it really is a tax essentially, because you build that into your budget and you never want to let it go. Um,
Mhm.
that's just a normal part of government. Um,
Yep.
but I do think there are some benefits to specific sectors, like you said, and I think that can be a real gain, especially in the car industry and in a few other things. But when we talk about tariffs, I think it is somewhat of a relic, with the free trade
Mhm.
kind of world that we're living in. Now, there's been a lot of talk about a unipolar world, America as a hegemon, America as an empire, and whether or not that's starting to break down. So you see
Hmm.
China really exerting pressure in the South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca. And you just see, Russia, although they're weakened from the war, they were certainly trying to make themselves into, a, a shell of their Soviet, past. And I think in that case, I think a trade war is almost unavoidable, because then the tariffs go from being an economic help domestically to a foreign policy necessity, because you want to play negotiations with sanctions and tariffs maybe even
Yeah.
before you get into, God forbid, a hot war with one of these countries. So then it becomes something like that, and I think that's what we're seeing with China. I think that the
Hmm.
Chinese tariffs are a power play. I don't think there's, there may be some domestic benefits to those kind of things, but I think it's mainly, something to ward off the Chinese, to assert ourselves over the Chinese going forward into the future. But yeah, I think generally you're right. I think tariffs they have a lot of downs and they have a very select few ups, in terms of positives and negatives. So, I really don't want to see a massive tariff policy hit the ground. That being said, I think some of this could be a play to, Trump's kind of blue collar manufacturing base. But then again, like you said, it's kind of hard to know what's going on inside of his brain. So, you know, like you said, I'm not an expert on this. Try to do the best we can with what we know.
Yep. Yep.
But I think in terms of Trump specific policies, I think it's kind of it's a multifaceted approach, and one that's more like a bargaining chip than
Hmm.
anything with real positives from the 25% and 10%.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that we largely agree on a lot of this stuff, but I was just interested. It sounds like, your commitment to these smaller scale tariffs being implemented is fairly tentative. I was interested in really digging into that a bit because I I'm just not seeing much justification on my end for tariffs based on what I've read. And maybe I've just looked at a bunch of progressive sources and there's a whole wealth of research out there supporting these sorts of measures that I just haven't seen at this time. But I'm just interested in the arguments and perspectives of anyone who might like defend a lot of these tariffs or really hope that they're maintained to some degree or in some scale or another. So what you're saying is that you maybe don't really have a big commitment to any small scale tariffs. That's something that kind of lies outside of your realm of expertise, so you're not really sure, but maybe it could be beneficial. Or would you say you have a stronger commitment to, let's protect these particular industries, this is where it might be beneficial, etc.
Yeah, I actually think I'm not really committed to them in any serious sense, and I think especially when we're talking about tariffing manufacturing jobs. Now, this gets into a very touchy conversation for a lot of people because as we move into the future with AI and with really the technological revolution that we're going through, some of these things may become obsolete, like the
Hmm.
longshoremen. I don't know if you remember that strike that happened. Um, China doesn't have longshoremen. It's all AI. It's all automated. So a lot of these businesses that we're tariffing, may become obsolete, and that those protections may even slow us down from innovating. Which part and parcel of doing business in a democracy with free people. You can't
Hmm.
just have top down policy enforced. But as to your specific question, I do fear a little bit the labor runaway. And I've
Hmm.
heard just in my own anecdotal experience that some amount of tariffs extended over a long period of time can help solidify a labor base within the United States. Um, Now, as with all economic policy, there's the seen and the unseens. And, no one,
Hmm.
I think there's very few people in the world that have the whole map of how a specific policy will affect everything. Um, but
Hmm.
yeah, as for my personal commitment, I think it's maybe I'd like to see it just to know, but I'm not totally sure of how these things would work. And I think
Hmm.
going back to it, I think it is a useful bargaining chip. But that being said, when you're playing poker and you put the chips on the table, you got to be willing. You got to be willing to raise. You got to be willing to call. And I think that could be dangerous, and that's how you get into trade wars and all these other things. So yeah, not totally committed.
Yeah, and I should clarify that I do see some of the positives to tariffs in the sense of, a bargaining chip, and also in the sense of maybe with certain tariffs, we can get around various loopholes that exist to the point where they can actually increase manufacturing in the United States. It's not just we put a tariff on China, so now a lot of Chinese companies, do some more manufacturing in, I'm not sure, maybe Indonesia or something like that, and then just send those products there at roughly the same price, and the tariff doesn't really have much of an effect and doesn't create more manufacturing in the United States, or if it does, it's only for a select few industries producing raw products instead of, all of the downstream manufacturing that use those products as inputs for other products. So I can see some potential benefits here, but as I said, I'm just not seeing as far as like if we just focus on the economic picture, what this is going to do for the United States. But maybe there's something out there. Let's turn maybe away from the question of North American tariffs for a moment, because early on you said we need to take this, as two separate spheres. There's the North American tariffs, there's our trade agreements with kind of, maybe closer our partners or allies, and then there's the China question. In the United States, competition with China, what trade policy looks like there, why we use tariffs there. So give me a little bit of your perspective, and you kind of have already, but maybe there's some things you want to flesh out here on what policy should look like with respect to our tariff policy on China, and why you feel that way.
Yeah, well, if we could take a zoom out for a second, what should the posture be towards China in general? This is something that's kind of hard to grapple with. And I think there's a little bit of détente that goes into here, a little bit of, Nixonian politics where Trump goes to these places. He meets with Xi, he met with Kim Jong Un. He wants to meet with Vladimir Putin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I think when you're looking at it that way, you want cooperation, right? You don't just want to put China in the adversarial country box and then just
Mm-hmm.
go into a trade war with them if that's what you have to do. If you can find another pathway towards cooperation, through free trade, through these other things, then that would be great. But I don't know if that's what China really wants. They're very proficient liars, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think sometimes they speak the language of modernity, and I think they speak the language of the UN to get what they want out of other countries in terms of support. I don't know if you know anything about their Belt and Road Initiative and some of the things that they're doing,
A
but
bit, yeah.
it's hyper aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
Like Somalia, for example, is just one country you could use. Nairobi. They go
Nairobi, I believe, is the capital of Kenya.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So, they go into these places and they offer, infrastructure, they offer money to build all these things, and then they kind of embed themselves within that, and
Yep.
the countries get dependent on that budget, and it kind of turns into a more adversarial relationship. So I think in terms of China policy in kind of a zoomed out perspective, we have to take them for what they are. Would I like to see a little more cooperation? Yes, I think a lot of that would have to start on their end, and I think Trump's attitude towards this is kind of a reaction to China, not the other way around. I think China is the one that's kind of distancing themselves from us. Now, like you said, you went into this a little bit. Um, Biden didn't touch Trump's tariffs on China. In fact, he greatly
Mm-hmm.
expanded them on things like EVs, and some other things. So that seems to be real and tangible because if China wasn't adversarial, posturing themselves that way, I think Biden, may have reason to play nice with the Chinese. But he didn't. He really didn't at all. So I think that's kind of how you have to look at it. It's more of a reality of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think with respect to China, a lot of what we're seeing in U.S. policy is fairly bipartisan. For the most part, our kind of relationship there. I am curious though, with respect to these tariffs and maybe expanding them further. Obviously Trump has, postured a lot about implementing that just overall 10% tariff. I'll need to double check the details to see exactly when that goes into effect or if it already has. But I'm just really curious about comparing this to the performance of our so-called trade war with China during Trump's first term. And looking at the effects there, because you mentioned how maybe if China is adopting this adversarial perspective, we should implement tariffs to use that, kind of as a way to, I don't know, respond appropriately or maybe get some concessions from China. Maybe give them, to some degree, a taste of their own medicine with the sort of economic leverage and pressure that they exert on other countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. But I mean, when we just look at what happened in Trump's first term, how effective are these sorts of policies? How effective is this stance with China? And was the Biden administration maintaining it because it was effective in reducing Chinese aggression or gaining concessions from the Chinese government, or was the Biden administration maintaining these as a result of sort of inertia? Once tariffs are implemented, they're hard to get rid of. I mean, maybe an argument against that is they expanded the tariffs, so obviously it seems the Biden administration thought there was some use in them. But I'm just curious what actually happened as a result of this trade war that was good. And is the comparison valid that I'm making? Was there some difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw during Trump's first term? And do you have any thoughts on any of this, or is this kind of, something down the road when we've both done more research?
Yeah, well, I think trade wars are never good. I don't think it's a situation you ever want to be in. Now, that being
Hmm.
said, I think there is some value to separating our economies because they've been joined at the hip in a lot of different sectors for a long time. And if they are taking this posture, then that's something we need to consider. Now, as far as Biden's actions go, I think the EV market is something that he really cared about and really wanted to push. So I think his tariffs on the EV market in China, I think that was a more direct response to him wanting to solidify the United States EV market,
Hmm.
which is something China has been hyper aggressive in trying to build. They really see it as the future, which I think it is. But yeah, I don't think trade wars are ever something you want to get yourself into. I think this is I think it's a part of the game. China is a power. They have really really stretched themselves in the foreign policy realm,
Hmm.
and they're really trying to dominate. Economically. Does that move to a military domination? Um, I don't know. There's this idea of the law of the jungle that there's someone on top,
Hmm.
and there's always going to be people try to take that spot from them. Now you can talk about whether or not that's realistic or not in a modern sense, but I think there's China definitely has far-reaching aspirations, and I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to get some separation between our two economies.
Well, I mean, the international sphere is inherently anarchical. Was that the word? Anarchical, anarchic?
Archaic,
Um,
maybe that would work too.
maybe would archaic be more just like something really old?
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah, yeah. I was thinking in the sense of, it's an anarchy.
I see
There's
what you're
no
saying.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's no, like the UN doesn't have enforcement mechanisms. And so it is, essentially the law of the jungle, and anything we have, that's maintained between countries is just a matter of norms, maybe enforced by something like sanctions or, the desirability of international cooperation. But, at the end of the day, that's kind of the nature of the situation and why it's very different from a domestic, just domestic politics in general. Um, but in any case, we've talked a lot. We've gone on for, I think, roughly 40 minutes now. Um, Thank you, Eric, for walking me through a lot of these policy issues and kind of offering your perspective based on your research. I learned a lot. I thought that this was valuable, at least for me. If nothing else, even if nobody watches this, I thought it was an enjoyable conversation for us too.
Yes.
So thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts, or do you think that's a good place to leave it?
No, I don't have any closing thoughts. It's always a pleasure, Sam. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And we will see you all next week for an additional episode. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.